Good afternoon, good morning, and good night. YouTube is available worldwide, so wherever you may be, thank you for listening. I really had to make a short stream here because, I was reading about uh, history and the King of England named Henry II, and I was interested in him because I was interested in St. Thomas Becket of Canterbury, and Henry II played a key part in this story. Now, I wasn't going to do any sort of podcast or whatever you call this kind of stream on it, but I had a book that I flipped open, and magically it landed on a story about Henry II. And so I just thought, I'll read this passage. I won't read the whole thing. I'm not quite sure what the book is about or what the context is of the passage. Really, I mean, the guy just throws in a short story about Henry II, and he was an awful king, right? And the author of this passage, after the short story, says, well, take it as evidence here that your ancestors were in general worse than you were, and that the people olden times were like horribly immoral and whatnot. And so I just have to refute this and say that Henry II was probably one of the most awful rulers of all time. And just because you have one historical example doesn't mean that uh, everyone before, was somehow degenerate and that progress is always happening. I mean, I I would say that probably, there's some sort of wage of sin that exists to Henry's rule. There's uh some sort of like, karmic reaction, some sort of butterfly effect that really brought down all of the whole world, whatever, Christendom, the kingdom of England, everything, because of this one monarch. And I also want to talk about Saint Thomas of Canterbury, Thomas Becket of Canterbury, because that is how I came upon to reading about Henry. I mean, you basically you can't have the story one without the other. So it kind of goes back to the year like 1150. So 1150 is how many years ago? Very many. That would be 878 years ago, 879 years ago, something like that. 880 years ago. Sorry, I'm doing the math in my head right now. And that Henry became, king. I'm not sure how exactly. I'm guessing that he was the heir, the firstborn son or something of the previous king, who may have been Henry the First, but I'm not. I don't think so. I mean, usually when you get the kings and you get like Richard the Third or something, or Henry the Fifth and Henry the Eighth, it's like the previous one with the same name was like their grandfather or something. It's usually not like in the line that it goes Henry One, Henry Two, Henry Three. But that being said, I'm not sure exactly who Henry the Second's father was or how he came to be king or whatnot. But so he became king. He was the king of England, and St. Thomas Becket of Canterbury was the bishop, the archbishop, I think you'd call it, maybe a cardinal bishop of England. So he was the chief administrator of the church in England at this time, around 1150. And the relationship between him and Henry was good. So much so that Henry would go to France, and when Henry was not in the kingdom, the ruler, the person in charge, was Saint Thomas. Now, there became a dispute between Henry and Saint Thomas. Basically, what it was Saint Thomas of Canterbury. He was too religious. He was too much wanting to enforce the religious laws, and he was not going to let that pass. And actually, the result of this, was Henry wanted to make the laws of the land. He wanted to write the law. And what the controversy over was not so much like, when I say religious law, like what the practice was. No, I mean the church. It was a Catholic religion, right? That was the same thing. It more had to do with corruption and Henry wanted innocent until proven guilty and that kind of thing, but he wanted like to let the he wanted to let the lower part, what would you call it, he would allow for priests to get married. He would let things like petty crime basically proliferate, and it's something you continue to see is a difference between Protestant and Catholic culture, is like the severity kind of petty crime. Petty crime is prolific with the German and America and stuff. It's not like it's not prolific too with the Catholic people, but their viewpoint of it is it's much more of a wicked thing, right? Like there's no sort of idea of someone was involved with a petty crime because of their circumstance. Like that's something that could never be accepted in the Catholic society. If someone has a bad circumstances, then they're a pauper, and there's pauperism, and that's a part of the culture. And there's never any sort of condition where someone could be forgiven for stealing a loaf of bread or something small. I mean, this is kind of maybe my idea about it, but I'm not saying I'm falling on Henry's side necessarily in him wanting to create his own law, and not have this religious law dominate the land. And so he basically created the English common law, and he exiled Thomas of Canterbury, and he threatened to kill him, and he left to live in France. And then he even wrote a letter to the Pope in Rome demanding that saying something like Thomas was a heretic. And so he was summoned to Rome by the Pope. And it's really, reflects kind of like some political dynamic here when you have the King of England expel the chief of the church in England and then get the Pope in Rome to call, to arrest him. But what ended up happening was, the Pope, whatever, he was holy, and he spoke with Thomas of Canterbury and met him, and he said he didn't even take away his position as the Bishop of England. There was nothing wrong with him. Henry, the second was just a tyrant, and maybe it would be fitting for me to actually read the passage I found. I just stumbled upon on him as I flipped open a book. It's weird how that happens sometimes. I don't know what it's called, like the devil's luck or something, right? When you just open up a book to a random page and you see something like, oh, I was just reading about this yesterday on Wikipedia, but there's nothing about this in the Wikipedia article. Here's what it says. Towards the conclusion of the reign of Henry VII. Oh, that's funny. I always do stupid things like this on streams. I'm talking about Henry II here. This is Henry VII. You know how Roman numerals look, though? They got the 2 on the 7, but I missed the V. Anyway, that doesn't, I'm not going to read that passage. That has nothing to do with it then, but, so one thing that happened between Thomas of Canterbury and the Pope was, see him. And it was Friday. And I guess their tradition is they eat fish on Friday. It used to be the tradition in the Catholic Church during those medieval times. Today, some people might do it in the United States, I think, just because like it's such a Protestant place, and for whatever reason, like the people in the US, they were like, we're gonna eat fish on Fridays because we're Catholic, and that's what makes us Catholic. But if you have ever like been outside of the United States and gone anywhere like to Spain or Mexico or wherever, I mean, no one eats fish on Friday. It's not like really a Catholic thing anymore. This is something that goes back to like 1,000 years ago. I bet in Poland, though. They still eat fish on Fridays. Anyway, what happened here was it was Friday, and Thomas of Canterbury, he ate some, he didn't have fish. He had some like meat, like he was eating regular meat. Because it's not like you couldn't get meat and eat it. It was just maybe you're really religious people that would eat fish on Friday. Think of how great that would be, though. Like, if your religion is like, what do you do to show the world that you're like the most pious person in the world? All you have to do is eat fish on Friday, and half the world doesn't even do it. But what happened here was, he wasn't eating fish, right? And the Pope called on him, and whoever was the messenger who went to Thomas saw he's not eating fish. And really the reason for it apparently was that there was like no fish to be found. He wanted to eat it, but all that was for sale was some meat. But the servant saw that. And so like Henry II had accused Thomas of being some sort of heretic or something. And this servant of the Pope figured that this was like, he's going to go and tell the Pope about this. he sees that already Thomas doesn't follow the church's law, which is what the whole thing was over in the first place. And so he took the meat from Thomas and wrapped it up in a handkerchief and left. And he went to the Pope. He said, "Look, Thomas was eating meat. I have it here in my handkerchief." And he unwrapped the handkerchief, and apparently there was fish in it. So somehow, in the story of St. Thomas of Canterbury, the fish was changed, or I mean, the meat was changed into a fish. And so the Pope saw that and thought, "What is this servant talking about? Of course he's eating fish. It's Friday." And so he called Thomas of Canterbury. Thomas of Canterbury comes before him, and the Pope says, "I heard you were eating meat." And Thomas of Canterbury says, "Yeah, I was eating meat. I couldn't find any fish." And then the Pope shows him the fish in the handkerchief. And then they realize, oh, it must have been changed, transformed. And so right then, I mean, then the discussion was over. The Pope said, "Go back to England or whatever. You're clearly a man of God because there's been a miracle like this." And Thomas said he thought, there's no way that Henry's going to let me live here. Take my my robe or something. And it was a white robe. And he said, "Take this and it will turn to red on the day I die because I've been assassinated by Henry." And so he gave it to the Pope and he left. And he never made it back into England. He went back to live in France. And Henry sent, his assassins to get him. And it was, I think, in the year 1170, they got Thomas of Canterbury. He was like praying in some church in France, and Henry II's men came in, and they say they cut his head open on the altar in the church, and that the inside of his brains went all across the front of the church. It's pretty gruesome story. And what happened, with Henry then the second after that was his kingdom went into civil war. He ended up assassinating two of his, also trying to kill him to become king. And then he had a son become king after he died, who was named Richard. They called this king Richard the Lionheart. And he has a cool, historical title, but it's like the Bible says the sins of the fathers shall be visited on the sons up until the seventh generation. I mean, all the sins went on to Richard, right? 7 times in one man, I believe. This guy, he is the Crusader king, but really, Jerusalem was ruled by the Christians, and when he became king of England, that Jerusalem fell, and he went to the Holy Land to try to retake Jerusalem, and he never retook it. It became, ruled by the Arabs once again, and this was a loss for all the whole Christendom. And how much of this has to do with Henry II, murdering the Bishop of England, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket. You can't say none of these actions are unconnected, and it's like a bunch of bad faith leading to something horrible happening, and more bad faith, and maybe perhaps the kings of England have been illegitimate kings ever since the time of Henry II. I would believe that. I mean, I guess there could have been some sort of restoration, some sort of forgiveness, but certainly, certainly Henry II and Richard, did not expand the power of the kingdom. And one other thought too, I read a description of Henry II, and he was a short guy with red hair and a horrible temper, fat. I don't know, kind of that description exactly matches everything that you would think, I believe, about a person based on the story I just told. I mean, so yeah, I read the story of Sir Thomas of Canterbury, and after later on finding that description of Henry II, it totally gelled with the image that I already had of him reading the story of Thomas Becket of Canterbury. Anyway, I hope I can. I hope this video can be like of use to some students of history here on YouTube. I'm sure there's a lot of good Henry II videos, but there's probably not a lot that are like this, where I really present the story of St. Thomas and really, try to give a characterization of Henry too, and not just talk about what he did, but like maybe sort of how he how he should be perceived, if I'm gonna believe in like moral law and that kind of thing. I mean, he modern historians, they tend to like look at people and leave the character out of it completely. Yeah, sometimes I can benefit myself by being a judge of character. Well, there's probably more to find out about Henry II, so I better go and get a reading.